Hi, I hope you're all safe and well. It was so lovely reading all of your comments on my last YouTube video. I've picked another book to read. This one's called Oranges in No Man's Land and it's by an author called Elizabeth Lard. Now, what I'm planning on doing is sharing a couple of chapters each day. Once we've finished the book, hop on over to Accelerated Reader and select the button I was read to and take a go at the quiz. So, let's start with the blurb. This was my chance. I slipped under the chain and bolted, running into no man's land as fast as my flip-flops would let me. Aisha lives in a battle-scarred building with her granny and her little brothers. Outside, a war is tearing the city apart, but Aisha doesn't even know why the two sides are fighting. Life gets even scarier when Granny falls ill, and Aisha has no choice but bravely to embark on the dangerous journey across no man's land for medicine. Will she be able to find a doctor and make it back before it's too late? Right, chapter 1. I was born in Beirut. It had been a lovely city once, or so Granny had told me. The warm Mediterranean Sea rolled against its sunny beaches, while behind the city rose mountains that were caped with snow in the winter. There were peaceful squares and busy shops and hotels bustling with tourists. My father and mother were farmers. They came from the countryside south of the city. They'd been happy in their little village, but they'd lost everything when Lebanon, our country, was invaded. They had to run away to Beirut. They had 3 children there, me first and then my 2 brothers. My father built a little house with his own hands in the poorest part of town, where everyone was crowded together in narrow lanes. All our neighbours were like us, refugees from southern Lebanon, trying to manage on nothing, but thankful at least to be safe. But just after I was born, all that changed. A terrible civil war tore the city of Beirut apart. I pray that those years never come again. I can never forget the horror of them. And yet, in among all the sad things, the fear and the destruction and loss, there are all wonderful memories too, of kindness and courage and goodness. I'll have to start my story though, with the saddest thing of all. Ours was a house of women and children. My granny, my mother, and my little brothers, Latif, who was 7, and Ahmed, who was still only a baby. My father was abroad most of the time, looking for work. He'd been gone for so long we were used to him being away. I'd almost begun to forget what he looked like. When, on that terrible day, the bombs started to fall all around our house, my mother threw some clothes into a bundle and began to pack our bags and cases. "There's no time for that," Granny screamed at her, looking out anxiously into the street. "The gunmen are coming. They'll be here any minute. We must take the children and run." Mama went on packing. She pushed a big bag into my hands and a smaller one into Latif's. Granny was already running down the street with Ahmed in her arms. "Go on, Aisha," Mama said to me. "Go with Granny. I'll be right behind you. Wait for me by the mosque on the corner." And so we ran. Latif and me racing ahead of Granny, who was hobbling along behind us with Ahmed in her arms. And a shell fell on our house just as we reached the end of the street, wiping out our little shack of a house and everything in it. I never saw Mama again. Chapter 2. It was a bright morning in Beirut. No, I can't begin there. I must think back a little further, to the place we found to live in during those muddled, desperate weeks after Mama died. I don't want to remember the first few days, the panic and confusion and the aching loss. It was Latif who found the flat for us. Little brothers do have some uses, I suppose, although I didn't often think so then. The 4 of us were sitting on a doorstep in a ruined street, feeling hungry and hopeless, after 2 days of wandering from place to place. All we'd thought about was how best to get away from the fighting. We had no food left and no idea where we'd spend the night. Granny looked so old and worn and beaten, I could hardly bear to look at her. I think she'd given up hope. Ahmed was crying. "There are people up there, in that window," Latif suddenly said, pointing across the road to the first floor of the building opposite. "Look, Granny, they're waving to us." That was the first kind, good thing that had happened to us since the disaster, and it was how we met Samar, who was 10 years old like me, and Samar's mother, dear Mrs. Zainab, the best mother in the world, after mine. A few minutes later, we'd crossed the road, pushed open the broken street door of the building, gone up the dusty steps and found ourselves in what must have been a beautiful flat where rich people would have lived. I can remember standing in the doorway, looking round in amazement. I'd never been in such a place before. The windows had all been blown out, and there were gaping holes in the walls where shells had blasted through, but you could still see how magnificent it had been in the olden days. Even the hallways were huge. The floor was made of marble, and there were big mirrors on the walls with elaborate gold work around them. You could see beyond the hall into amazing rooms, all light and airy with high ceilings from which ruined chandeliers hung at crazy angles. The people who had owned this flat must have left long ago, and they'd taken their beautiful furniture and fancy clothes with them. But the rooms weren't empty. They were full of people, refugees, squatters, poor people from bombed out parts of town, people with nowhere to go, people like us. I could see through the open doors that they'd made corners of their rooms their own. They'd set up little homes with their own mattresses and cooking pots and strung up clothes on strings to make partitions so that each family could have a bit of privacy. Mrs. Zainab came out into the hall towards us. She was comfortable looking, with smile wrinkles around her eyes. She wore a long tattered dress and had a scarf tied over her head. "You poor thing," she said. "I couldn't let you go on sitting there, with night coming on and all. Have you got somewhere to go? Are you lost?" It was then that Granny burst into tears, and Latif and I were